about the mundane whirl and learning in the dark. And the mundane whirl is a description of samsara. It's written in the Flower Ornament Sutra, which is called the Keikan Kyo in Japan and the Huayan Sutra in China. And mundane refers to your ordinary everyday life. And the whirl refers to something that seems to go around in circles. And this is a description of ordinary life with self as the navigator. And it goes around in a closed circle because it does not see the big picture, and because for the self, the status quo is the best survival. So it just goes around in the same thing. And it's always at the mercy of outside circumstances and lost in kind of cycles of birth and death without end. And besides that, I wanted to talk about learning in the dark, which all of us go through at some point in practice. And learning in the dark is like becoming a child again. So previous experience and your thinking mind are no longer useful when you begin to learn in the dark. Previous experience instead deludes us, and the thinking mind confuses us. Through close personal contact, we meet others, but we can't form opinions about them because this is learning and meeting in the dark. And so we can't rely on opinions and thinking as we have before. We're more like roots at the bottom of the pond, like the lotus roots and the stalks that come up out of the roots and intermingle with other stalks in endless intermingling. And we're like that in the dark. We are constantly intermingling with others in the dark, none of whom we know or understand, unable to form opinions to guide us, and just guided more by the action rather than understanding what's going on. So, like the lotus roots, we are intermingling with everyone, but we're also heading upwards to maturity and blossoming. We are so close, in fact, with others that we can hardly separate our emotions and thoughts from those of others. So we have to live with the effects of that for a while, and not understanding why we're feeling anger, not understanding why we feel joy or happiness, not understanding the emotions in the previous way by outside definition. But yet we're experiencing many of the feelings of our intermingling. At this point, we have to learn what makes us different from others. But to do that, we have to learn who we are separate from others. So we cannot, if we resist the merging of others with us in the dark, and if we cannot let things go quickly without clinging in the dark, so learning in the dark becomes hampered by this. When learning in the dark, non-clinging, though, becomes a great virtue for survival and learning. Learning in the dark, non-clinging is probably the greatest virtue for survival. We really have to learn not to be unafraid of others, so we can be like free-ranging lotus plants in the water, merging and growing freely to the top of the pond. So we both merge and leave without resistance at the same time. And we have to learn not only how to see ourselves, as we believe ourselves to be, but we have to learn how to see ourselves as others see us as well. And we can let go of our rigid personal ideas about ourselves eventually. In the dark, we tend to experiment with new behavior more openly than we do in the light. Old images of ourselves begin to fall away, and our teachers guide us without interfering in our experiments, and we wander in new ideas and knowing ourselves in more ways than one. We're happy to experience a new way of feeling and looking at reality. In the dark, our lives take on not only the frustration of difficulty and misunderstandings, but it also becomes a fairy tale like change, an adventure, and many of the old stories we learned as children begin to make more sense in our lives. And wonder comes calling. In the dark, we forget the hardships of not knowing as relationships with our true self, our Buddha nature, begins to take on new life, and we also begin to feel both loved and cherished. And from that, we find a take on new life, and we begin to feel, and from that, we find a new confidence. We begin to find it easier to help others because, in the reality of ordinary life, being able to see the full extent of suffering and hardships became overwhelming. But in the dark, it's just one person after another, and we freely extend ourselves to help with the happiness of another. It becomes extending warm hand to warm hand. Many people at this time discovered new talents that have been there all along, but were never used, and new answers that have been lying around unused because there was no encouragement. But lucky for us, we begin at some point to learn in the dark. We have to discard what we learned and from the outside and develop everything from the inside to navigate ourselves now. Lucky for us at this point, we can't be dependent on the self as we were before, because body, speech, and mind are of not much use at first in the dark. We meet circumstances we don't understand and have to meddle our way through without knowing what's happening. This gives us experience that we try to comprehend more from the inside than looking outside to someone or something to explain it. And we can't apply previous experience to it. But at first, this is a very trying experience, and we often imagine the worst. But our teachers, who have also been through this, will keep us on track. At first, learning in the dark is an unnerving experience, but if we can keep our thoughts in check, we can get through it very well. This is a new way of relating to others who are also learning in the dark along with you. The practice can no longer be developed by intelligent conversation or reading, but by a more intimate and direct relationship with others who are now in the same training. In a one-to-one connection now, such as in a mutual gasho, a mutual smile, a nod, a handshake, a smile, a wink, or a no comment expression. It becomes a very direct communication with others now, without words. And our teachers are no longer the sweet, patient people we have come to depend on, but they have become more strict and wait to see how the discipline we already have is applied to our new situations. And best of all, we begin to experience a sense of freedom from the yoke of self that we lived with for so long. Our Buddha nature begins to act in our life even more than before. And ordinary life becomes an adventure with new possibilities. Also, at this point, ordinary life becomes a life of entering an unspoken rule of silence. And explanations mean nothing at this time, so there's no place to sit down and chat about what's happening. The mind of thought and questions is now put on the back burner, and we learn to navigate without the constant comfort of questions and doubts, without thinking between us and the rest of the world. And we come to see that if we can keep criticism in check, learning in the dark can also be the time of great personal growth and awakening of joy. And that's all. And I hope you have a few questions about this, because all of you are probably either going through it or about to. It's a practice that everyone goes through. It's akin to climbing the 100-foot pole and leaping off into a complete unexplained realm. John?
So this reminds me a bit of that. The Zen, it's the idea that only in the dark can the reflection of the moon be seen. It reminds me of that. And could you define for me a little bit more? I know but what do you mean by the dark? Like, what, you didn't really give a definition of the dark. So
You have no explanation about what takes place, and you can no longer rely on outside information to understand what's happening. You have no signposts, and language is no longer as useful as it was in ordinary practice. So the teachers no longer give like explanations of everything that's happening, which I shouldn't be doing. And you muddle your way through, but mainly you begin to intermingle with others like you in the practice. And you often can't separate who you are from the person you're with. And so you begin to live the karma of other people until you wake up to that fact and stop doing it. So it's a situation where nobody sits down and says, don't do this, don't do that. And the precepts in that sense no longer apply. So what you haven't gained already from studying the precepts don't go with you into the dark, but hopefully they will. But they don't go as this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. It's all a different way of survival, but it's mainly no explanation and no language. And at the time of learning in the dark, your teachers, if you try to make them tell you something, will just tell you, no, sorry, figure it out.
So it's experience outside, it's kind of experience outside the cognitive. It's just, there is no cognitive, no speech. It's the experience outside that.
Yeah, and the biggest thing is you can't use your intellectual thinking to solve anything, because it doesn't, because it's not a world of rationale or logic in the same way. You begin to feel what other people feel, but you begin to feel it way too much. And at first you can't separate yourself from it. And then finally you have to stop and really think, well, who am I? This is not me. This is not the way I do things, etc. You have to take your own stand to discover who you are, so that when you do enter into emotions that you don't feel are really yours, you develop enormous compassion for the people who feel terrible, but you can't do anything about it if you feel terrible too.
So to me, it feels a little bit like, at least the word dark for me feels like a misnomer, and that really it's more about the light, and the light maybe being a little too bright at first, and not being able to solve any of it with the cognitive. But the dark makes me feel like it's a world without, but I feel like rather it's the world of everything once you pass through the cognitive. Is that kind of yes or no?
Well, when I was having a terrible time in Japan, I went to a teacher and I said, I'm just having this awful time with this, and this. And he laughed a little bit and he said, well, he said, what you're describing is someone who is in a dark room trying to maneuver their way around the dark room to keep bumping into furniture and hurting themselves. He said, wait till you understand the layout better and it'll bother you less.
I see. Thank you.
Mark.
Yes, it feels like death. Feels like this is the land that's similar to it, if not it. And my question is then who survives in this place?
Well, self does not. Self comes through with us, but Buddha nature, we discover who we are in this situation because we stop looking outside for explanations and we start looking inside more. And we understand that we're much more than a small person. And we begin to feel the effects of this Buddha nature in our life more than we do when we didn't even observe it at all. And Buddha nature begins to act in our life as well, because that is the real person. And acting in our life can make things a whole lot different, than when we do it with a very small mind.
Because we don't have to be anywhere in the darkness. We just have to be.
We just have to wake up to what's going on in the dark and realize you can't run from it. And realize we can't substitute things as we did in the ordinary life. We can't get lost in a TV or a show or something. We have to deal with the immediate circumstance if we don't want to go under with it. So if we're feeling really terrible one day, we shouldn't jump to the conclusion, oh, this is my usual way to feel. Of course it must be for this and this reason. And if you take it to a teacher at this point and say, why do I feel so bad? That you'll say, well, figure it out.
Okay.
Are you going to walk in this dark room by yourself without any observation or any awareness, or will you just take note that you bumped into this here so you'll avoid it next time? And he said it's also rubbing up against other people in very close circumstances. It's like the roots in the bottom of the pond, they just intermingle with all the other roots. But they don't just stay intermingled, they also separate as well, and then they keep moving up to the top of the pond. So you just have to remember that even in such a kind of what seems miserable at first, you are maturing without stop at this point. And the only thing that can actually sabotage that is criticism or negativity. So at this point, your biggest job is to stay alert and let go of things very quickly.
Would you say criticism and what was the other? Negative thoughts?
Yeah.
Or negative?
Getting lost in negative emotions.
This is we're talking about the ones we bring, not what others might bring to us.
Yes. Yes, because no matter what happens, we are still the one in charge. No matter. And it's still all 100% up to us to deal with it. And if we don't, we can never say it was this and this reason, because first of all, we have no idea what we're talking about. And second is, we are still always, always in charge. And we mustn't ever forget that. Even in the dark, we're the one in charge. So if we keep stumbling over the same block in a dark room, then we have only ourselves to blame, and to wake up to this fact.
Can I ask you something? What if we're in the middle of dismay? What about dismay, being in this dark place with dismay? What to do?
Well, that's probably a very commonplace happening, dismay. I can certainly think of times when any kind of practice could cause that kind of dismay. But again, you're the one in charge, and it's up to you to master your emotions, which in ordinary life we can find too many escapes from. But in the dark, there is no escape from dismay, no escape from negativity, other than mastery of yourself. If you can take a look and come back to number one, the start back at one, you will always see that it comes back always to you. And then when that happens, it's all in your hands what you choose. Dismay is a very common dismay.
Yes, I think of it as an unraveling and an inability to, instead of being stopped by, let's say, other circumstances, and you find that it's actually yourself that is the dismayed and the dismayer, I guess you could say.
That's right. Everything comes back to you finally. In the dark, you see that, but when you're in ordinary life, you almost never see that because it's so easy to find another reason. In the dark, it's very hard to find another reason. You only have yourself to depend on.
I found something, if I say, found something like that yesterday, where I was caught in a very dismayed situation and emotional, and there was no way to deal with it. And I realized I was in a situation where those around me were very confused, and I kind of caught it. And I wasn't able to find my way up unless I just let it ride.
Well, come back to yourself, because it always comes back to mastery of yourself in somebody, like the emotions, the confusion. You can handle that within your own self.
Yes.
And how you handle it is how the confusion that you're seeing is also the mirror. You're seeing parts of yourself running around. And so you master yourself and calm things down, first of all, with you, and then see what happens from there. Then work person by person, rather than group by group.
Thank you.
Okay. Rachel.
Rachel.
Thank you, Jane. With two things. One, I remember a book I had long ago. It was on night gardens, and they were flowers that will only, or blooms that will only flower at night. I mean, they require sunlight for sustenance, or the roots do, but they really will only bloom at night. And some people can have entire gardens that are nothing but that flower. And you can barely even see the beauty unless the moon is full. And it is that one aspect of what you're talking about. But the second is that being in the dark, or anyone, myself or anyone, being in the dark, it being natural, occurring repeatedly because it's naturally present. That wanting to escape it, and there occasions in which escape is prevented. That for the natural ways of exiting are closed, and in those, even if it's outwardly determined, but in those circumstances where stillness is imposed, but it can be a circumstance where you learn what you're describing. In other words, you do open to the darkness, and it's such a startle because I think John said it's really quite light. Do you know what I mean? It's such a startle that what was thought to be darkness through repeated prior attempts to live through them, all of a sudden it's a completely different, it's almost like a different climate. It's still dark, but it is, as you said, wondrous. But it had not been wondrous for a long time.
Yeah, this is the area where wonder begins, like incredible wonder about everything. Being in the dark doesn't mean you can't see. It just means you don't understand what you're feeling and seeing, because it's truly different. And one of the best ways, I think, is to keep your mastery of yourself strong and keep that in the forefront, because otherwise you confuse yourself with what's happening or confuse yourself with others, and that's doubling up the problem. So as long as you remember that you're the one that's always in charge, no matter what the circumstance is, and but it doesn't mean you can't see what you're doing. And in fact, you come to appreciate small, wonderful things in the world at this point, I think, because you just never realize how wonderful everything really was. So you begin to love all the small things about reality that you hardly noticed before. Anyway, the flowers you're talking about, I was thinking of the moonflower, which was always like a magical flower to me. It only blooms in the shade. It's a gorgeous plant, though.
I had
Yeah.
a peony once. It would only bloom, I guess, every 5 to 10 years, and we moved. I'd planted it, but we moved before it bloomed, and I tried to return to see it because it was like a moon. It was a really large peony, like it was called the moon peony. But anyway, yes. But does it not take a lot of time and experience? And I don't mean strictly just age. I don't mean years necessarily, but things we are not in control of, to bring us to the point where we really are capable of understanding choice in the dark.
I think when you're in a situation where it comes down to only you, you do depend on yourself in a way you never did in ordinary life. You stop looking at yourself as like an old woman, a young woman. You just stop all these definitions of yourself. You drop them off because they are totally irrelevant and they have nothing to do with the situations they're reading in other people. So it doesn't mean you stop being who you are. It just means you stop classifying yourself as who you are and depending on it. And if it calls for a more youthful outlook of something, there it is, where you never expected it would be. And if it calls you to be old and wise, there it is again. And it's like you just follow the flow and you understand that none of it came from you. you understand it's all coming from others, from people, from your great storehouses we were reading yesterday.
Thank you.
Oh, so you stop giving all the credit to yourself, and you start realizing what you're like a bottomless pit of everything possible. And you start to treasure that part of yourself as much as you would treasure, what you liked about yourself. Mark?
This self-mastery you're talking about is not adding things on, it's stripping things away.
It's taking off everything, yeah.
And this ownership of, it's not owning, it's removing. We're talking about going to the bare anything of you.
Yes, it's going down to the bone.
How does one get there?
In the dark. If you give over too much power, for example, to other when you're in the dark, you become at their mercy at the same time. And you can find yourself doing crazy things. People at this point end up doing really strange behavior. Nothing really bad, just strange, outside of their normal behavior. And it's a way of stretching the self in a way which makes you very uncomfortable. But actually, it also teaches you a lot at the same time. So but you really do experiment with yourself in a way you didn't realize you ever could.
This is not for the weak of heart.
No, none of it has been for the weak of heart for the very first. That's why in what's his name? Chogyam Champa, when he talked to it, he said we're actually warriors, spiritual warriors. And I think that's probably the more accurate description of what we do. And that's why I like the Manjushri in the center of the altar in the Zendo, because he carries a sword and a rope. And this is cutting through ignorance, and whatever else, and the flowers.
He's on the back of a lion?
He's on the back of a lion, yeah. I think that's the way it is for all of us, none of us can rely on others to do this work for us, and that's why it's so hard. And so your teachers at this point can't really even tell you what to do, but they can tell you what not to do,
Yes, I understand that. That's a head scratcher, but I'm looking at it in my rational mind because I know it's.
I had one time with my teacher in Japan where
Mhm.
I felt like I was going crazy, with what was happening. And I said, can I ask you one question? And she said, you can ask me one question and that's all. And don't ever ask another. And so I asked her, am I going crazy? And she said, no, you're not. And that was it. She said, now don't ever bring this up again. Don't ever ask me any question like this again. And so I never did after that. I was very careful not to. But there were many times I'd like to have asked him, are you sure? But you have to rely on yourself at this point, and you can do that by always coming back to 1, 0, and 1, and 2, and 3, like that, so that take stock so you don't get lost in the ideas of others, and don't get lost so that you end up acting on the urges of others. It's you really have to become like a warrior. There's no other word for it.
I think that's it.
But it's also your Buddha nature begins to act with you, and that's one of the big, wonderful things of it. You can feel the difference when you suddenly know something and know how to behave, know what you need to do, etc. You understand that's not yourself talking, that's some bigger, deeper part of you coming through at the right moment.
I think sometimes our logical, rational, or those other selves we have that are not stripped away, are too willing to make deals and too willing to compromise and make do.
Yeah, but remember, you're always the one in charge, so these other selves, etc., it's not you don't have them, they are you. So remember, you are the one in charge, or if you don't like what someone is doing, you could always say, you sit down.
I do.
You stop talking.
Rachel,
Rachel?
Sorry to speak again, but I just wanted to say when someone is in the dark and you mentioned others and that merging and wonder, just an appreciation of everything, everyone around you, even disagreeable other ones. I just want to say it is hard, especially if it's really dark, to hear another in the dark, in agony, really, striking out, because everyone is different in that experience. And it's just hard. I don't mean what do you do or can you take care. I don't, just experiencing and understanding someone else, perhaps deep distress. That's awfully hard. Uh, even if it's enlightening, it's hard.
Yeah, but you can't help them if you get into deep distress as well. That's where you have to remember who you are, and then you can help them. If you get lost in their suffering, you can't do anything much except look for help yourself. It's hard because you always have to keep coming back to yourself to remember, wait, this is where I am. This is not me. But if you pay attention, you can learn so much at this point too.
I think that's it. Time for service?